Thank you, Mark. Well, this panel came together great and is very timely. We had actually information today come out that quoted a couple of you, so I know I got the right people. Sort of funny, we were talking out in the hallway earlier about, when you know something about what you're reading about, it's always amazing to me how inaccurate it is. So hopefully we've got the sources here. You're not going to hear it secondhand. These guys are a great team, great resources for you going forward, whether you've got buildings you're going to be dealing with or wanting to start something new. But I think this topic, when you combine it with some of the rent control aspects that we're sitting with right now, I mean, you combine these two factors and we've got some issues we're going to have to deal with. So they're going to go through their presentation. They'll take questions at the end. So don't fear, you will have an opportunity to ask. But I'd like to introduce Brian Emmerich, Emmerich Architects. Brian is Emmerich Architects leader on commercial work with extensive experience in adaptive reuse in historic buildings. He is a former chair of the Portland Historic Landmark Commission, which gives him a detailed understanding of interagency relationships and the latest trends involving heritage buildings of all kinds. We've got Ben Kaiser, Kaiser Group, Inc. Ben is committed to mass timber construction, believes in its future of sustainable development. He is an advocate for its efficient construction, environmentally responsible development, safety, and seismic resilience. His most recent project, Carbon 12, is the tallest CLT building in the United States. I'm sure he can tell you more about that. Finally, we've got, from the construction side, Jake Sly with R&H Construction. He's a proud duck. Lives in LO, that's a good thing. Both those are good things. Business Development Director, Pre-Construction Manager. Jake has worked for RH Construction for the past decade and is a graduate of the University of Oregon, where he received a BS in Environmental Science. R&H Construction Company has been building successful commercial construction projects throughout the Pacific Northwest since 1979. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Jake and the team, and look forward to having a great conversation. Thank you.
All right, thanks, David. Well, David approached me. We kind of had a offhand meeting, and he said, "Oh, we got a panel that's going to convene in about 8 days. How would you like to join it?" And so naturally, brought the two subject matter experts to the panel. Thought what we would do is kind of start out at a real high level. I've had the opportunity to work with both of these gentlemen in different projects, different capacities, and Brian really has a great sensibility about historical renovations, and through his involvement in the URM building committee process, probably knows more about what has happened in this whole, I would say, volatile process than anyone. Currently working with Ben on some projects, and as David mentioned, he's a real forward thinker and is always willing to look at things from a different perspective and not just follow the status quo. And so we kind of joked about this, that there's not going to be any fist fights, but if need be, we will definitely separate these two. But no, two individuals with a lot of passion. Sometimes they'll align and sometimes there'll be some divergence in their perspectives, but I think that's what makes them so valuable. So with that, I was going to open it up, first of all, to Brian to kind of put a framework around what is it that everyone's talking about with this big quake that's going to come, and the different types of earthquakes, and kind of everyone go back to college in that geology class that you may or may not have attended. And we'll have a quick refresh of Geology 101 here.
Well, that sounds good, because that's about probably all I'm qualified to give. I draw pictures for a living, so. But what we're really talking about are two different threats from earthquakes. The big one everyone talks about, of course, is the subduction zone quake, which used to be fairly not understood or even known until about 20 years ago, and now is one of the most studied faults in the world. It would be a major earthquake centering off the coast that obviously would generate a tsunami as well, but that's not going to impact Portland. But the big difference with the subduction zone quake versus other types of earthquakes like you see in California and whatnot is the length of the shaking and the magnitude. So it'd be a magnitude 9.0 probably off the coast and shake for probably up to 3 minutes versus a usual kind of 30-second kind of event in a 6-7 magnitude. So that's one threat, and what the latest statistics are is there's probably around a 20% probability that would happen in the next 50 years based off of like 10,000 years of data. And the other threat, which is really not well known and doesn't factor into any of the risk factors that you hear, and the percentages would be a local crustal quake, which actually could be more devastating in some ways because it's would be like what created the West Hills essentially. So local fault break. And those might be, magnitude 7, but much closer to the source.
So when you talk about that 9, the 9 is happening hundreds of miles offshore, and so by the time that it makes its way here, it might be a 6 or a 7.
Yeah.
That lasts for
3 minutes.
For 3 minutes.
I mean, I think it's like 60 miles offshore maybe, so it'd be, a couple hundred miles from Portland though.
So you still wouldn't want to be in Seaside.
No, definitely not there.
And maybe Jake and Brian can just tell everybody, because I don't think they know that he was on the UNM commission.
Right, and so a lot of his as a architect by day, geologist by night, was because he has dedicated 3 years to the commission, and we'll talk a little bit about the backstory on that. But yeah, so that's how Brian kind of became knowledgeable about the geology and what the real threats are. And I think talking the other day about some of the other faults in the United States that are probably even less understood, but are threats as well.
Yeah, and I mean, even when we talk about the Christchurch quake, I don't think that fault was actually known, and it created a devastation.
So everyone's familiar with the New Zealand quake that happened back in 2011, and I think what were some of the lessons that were learned from that one, Brian, that you took away that applied directly to your work on the panel?
Well, the city studied that earthquake in quite a bit of detail, and they actually sent a delegation to go down there and meet, look at the damage, and talk to the locals about what actually happened. And like I said, I think it was an unknown fault. I don't have all the statistics, but somewhere around 50 people died. It was a fairly modest quake. It was like a magnitude 7, I believe, but it was centered very close. So it'd be like one of the West Hills type of earthquakes we'd be talking about here. And it actually caused a lot of damage in the central core. There actually had a lot of unreinforced masonry buildings, had kind of a large historic town footprint, and I think around 50 people died. The vast majority of those were actually in the public right-of-way of buildings collapsing into the street. So it's a pretty good comp in terms of what kind of a run-of-the-mill earthquake might do. And even 2 years after the event, a lot of the central business district was still closed down because even if the buildings didn't collapse, they were still like so hazardous they had to close the streets off and stuff. So from a resiliency standpoint, that's really what the Portland Bureau of Emergency Management was studying. It's not just the impact of the event, but what's the economic impact long term in terms of losing business, closing down the district, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, and I think that was one of the interesting things to me is for the seismic upgrades that are being proposed under this, proposal, it's not that at the end of a seismic event, all these buildings are perfect and everyone walks out fine, right? I mean, the goals seem like they're much lower than that. What we don't want is buildings falling onto the right-of-way. And you mentioned a story about there was 2 buses parked out in the Christchurch quake.
Yeah, so this is actually kind of a compelling story. The mayor of Christchurch actually did a video address to the city council in advance of the presentation of the recommendations for the URM stuff we're talking about, and imploring city council to really take some action because they unfortunately didn't. And the story that she talks about is 2 tour buses were downtown, both parked in front of unreinforced masonry buildings. One of the buildings had been upgraded lightly, and the other building had not. And the building that had not collapsed onto a bus and killed 13 out of the 14 people on the bus. The bus behind was much more fortunate because the building didn't collapse, and everybody survived on that. And kind of the big takeaway was besides the death toll, was basically that the one survivor had so much damage to her leg that it cost over $2 million in surgery to repair her leg after the event, and the cost of the upgrade to the neighboring building was $150,000. So it's kind of like this thing where we always react, it seems like a lot in our government, and instead of like proactively looking at what can we do to prevent these things in advance, and the cost savings is so much more significant.
Thanks. So back in 2015, the New Yorker ran an article called The Really Big One. How many people here read that article? How many people then went and bought survival kits? So, I mean, I now have water in my garage, and I think that was kind of a wake-up call for me. But I guess, Ben, a question for you is, do you think that helped Portland collectively, or what's your take on what the impact of that article was as a society here in the Pacific Northwest?
I think that's a great question. I think it's a great question regardless of what the topic is really to analyze from a logical standpoint what that means. So I think it was sensationalist writing, The quote was something to the effect of everything west of I-5 would be toast. I think that was the one that everybody kept quoting over and over. And that has never happened in the history of the world. No earthquake has ever affected anything to that degree. Sorry about that. And so, and I think what this does is just accumulate guilt without really a process to solve it. I think that when you're making decisions based in fear, you make the worst kind of decisions. And I think if we really look at the logic behind what we're trying to do here, there's a better way to go about it. And it's, I do sympathize with Christchurch, but when you invest that amount of money to save 50 people, you really got to run the numbers on what that objective is for billions of dollars to save 50 people. When there's so many other things challenging all of us every single day, and where we place our very, very precious resources, that's, I think, the interesting thing to study to see what the best takeaway is. So.
Well, and to that end, I think one of the things that has become apparent to me is just maybe a lack of understanding of what the code currently is requiring and hasn't been enforced. And so is this one of those examples of, well, we've already got laws in place, we don't need new laws, what we need is enforcement of existing laws. And so both of you as architects, developers, owners, can you speak to us a little bit more about, active versus passive, like what triggers the upgrade and what some of those are kind of at the basic level? And I'll start with Brian.
Sure. So the current code's really what I would call an active-based code system, and that's predominantly what the kind of work we do is. Like, someone wants to take an old brick warehouse and turn it into a cool creative office with food and beverage on the ground floor or something. Well, you're changing the use of the building and you're going to a higher hazard, so that's the trigger that the city's able to use to say, you know what, you need to make this building safer because we're putting more people at risk. That's kind of the basics. If you don't do anything to that building, you just leave it there as a storage building, there's really no trigger for the city to come and be able to have an ask to say, you've got to make this building safer, it could collapse in the street and kill people. So that's what a passive trigger would be and that's what was really the debate of the whole URM committee, was making recommendations of how can we make some of these passive triggers that would be reasonable to be able to get buildings safer, essentially. So in the active trigger, the upgrades are much more robust, and they could go all the way to like current code or something in between. And there's a financial incentive on the developer side because you're able to, take storage rent and turn it into food and beverage and creative office rent. So that's how the engine that fuels it and makes that work in the pro forma. And that's commonly what we're dealing with private development. Those buildings are also tend to be unoccupied, or not unoccupied, unoccupied during construction, basically. So that's a really big difference and important cost to factor in with the passive trigger, is that we're talking about occupied buildings now. So that's a big difference.
And then for you, Ben, as you're looking at new properties or existing properties to upgrade, do you see, or have you yourself been guilty of trying to figure out how do I stay under those thresholds, or do you see that people are kind of finding ways to game the system, if you will, to avoid those triggers?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think I started work in the 90s in the Pearl District, and I think everybody in the city of Portland knew how to kind of sneak around these voluntary upgrades and stay right below the thresholds that would trigger them. And it seemed even for a decade or two, the city was in cahoots with us. Like everybody knew that we were trying to avoid these triggers. And I think one thing that came up at City Council a few weeks ago is, had we all collectively just made sure that those had some teeth, when you did a new roof, then you had to do the diaphragm, or when you did trigger those financial benchmarks, you would have to do a certain upgrade, just like the ADA has. I think we all realize, looking back over 20 years now, and understanding the potential for a large quake, which we didn't really know about. This is all an iterative process, which we all have to cut ourselves some slack for, because we're all learning more information with every year that goes by, right? So in the 90s, the seismic code was very different than it is even today. Even if you built a brand new building, that would not be in code today, which is a fascinating thing to think about, where this is going and where it could go. But we all did skirt around as much as we could. And I think City Council a few weeks ago, I think it was Nick Fish maybe, who said, if just those voluntary upgrades had more teeth. So when you did a roof, the roofing companies weren't going around the outside, and if you did a diaphragm, they weren't going around the outside. Or if you did over $200,000 a year, you'd have to do the upgrade. Those things, I think, would put it more into the voluntary realm rather than the mandatory realm. And that's the big discussion, right? The mandatory realm goes into your occupied apartment building, into your occupied small retail and makes it mandatory, regardless of a change of use, regardless of anything. If the same business is operating for 20 years, we don't really care. You'll have to do the upgrade. That's the big difference that we're talking about, voluntary versus mandatory.
So the URM Building Committee, that is the hot topic. That's the hot seat that Brian's been sitting in. So can you just kind of let the whole group kind of know the genesis of this committee, how long it's been kind of viable and active, and kind of what was the conclusion, if any, basically, and what are the kind of the next steps from there? I think I'd be kind of curious to hear from you, what was the process, and then counterpoint from Ben of, as an outsider somewhat, what was your perception of how the process was handled, and maybe moving forward, how could it be improved?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. So the Unreinforced Masonry Committee was basically put together at the request of City Council through Commissioner Steve Novick, who's no longer there, and this was about 4 years ago, with the goal of having 3 different committees come forward to make recommendations to City Council on how we could get better resilience and better conformance to the existing code too. So, and the 3 committees were the Technical Advisory Committee, which consisted of myself, the state geologist, and maybe 5 engineers, including the head structural engineer for City of Portland. Then the goal of that was really to make, what would be the reasonable recommendations on the technical side to make buildings safer. The second committee was how do we pay for them? It was the financing committee. And then the third committee was a diverse group of stakeholders, which I also served on and went 2 years, unfortunately. And with the goal of being able to make recommendations to City Council that blended, some sort of reasonable ask on the technical side with what can we afford as a community and where does the money come from. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. It was supposed to take a year. It took 4 years. So that tells you how contentious it really was. And I think, along the way, the technical committee really came out, and I was actually a dissenter with, we need to bring these buildings pretty close up to code. And to me, that was definitely not feasible. We don't have the resources to do that. And I knew that wasn't going to fly. The financial committee, unfortunately, didn't come up with any real money. So that really put a tough onus on the recommendation committee of what are we going to recommend to City Council, which is partly why it took 2 years. In the end, they did go and get a valuable tool by lobbying at the state, which is Senate Bill 311, and what that is a property tax exemption that can be passed locally. It applies statewide that basically would exempt your improved value on the property for 15 years. That you could apply that toward seismic upgrades. So, and the goal was really to be able to get a substantial amount of the upgrades financed publicly, because there's a lot of public benefit that accrues to this in terms of resiliency and safety in the right-of-way, and that there would be some ask also on the private side, but it would be somewhat modest, relatively speaking. So,
And how many buildings were identified through this process?
So there's about, I think, 1,640 unreinforced masonry buildings, something like that right now. The vast majority of those are what we call a class 3, and that's where all the contentious debates really been about. And that would be kind of your regular streetcar commercial, 2-story, 1-story, 3-story bricker, basically. The other types of buildings would be like Portland Public Schools, big masonry buildings. That would be a class 2. Those are to a higher standard, and that was recommended. And then a class 1 would be something that would be like a power station or an emergency provider, or something that needs to be what we call immediate occupancy, and that's a whole other category of basically right after the event it's still serviceable. Like you had alluded to, Jake, the code, even for a brand new building, the code isn't that the building's usable right after the event. So people often think that, but the building actually could be substantially damaged. The goal is that it doesn't collapse and kill people. So.
Yeah. And then Ben, kind of someone who I know has been very active, obviously in commercial real estate, and in that, what was your kind of perception, if you will, of the process? I'm sure you had your finger on it.
Yeah, and I think we all actually owe Brian a round of applause, because the work of 4 years is amazing. So actually, if we don't mind, let's clap for Brian. And I mean that honestly, because it's a volunteer process, and they took a lot of heat through it, because as the issue grew more and more public, they were more and more in the hot seat, because they were just trying to improve the city. And I think we'd all agree, probably in this room, the objective would be for every building to be completely upgraded. And I think this city council and Brian's commission was just struggling with how to do that, how to achieve it. So I think it was a fantastic process. I think what was unfortunate was, as Brian mentioned, the schism between no financing, no ability to help pay for it, and then another higher requirement. And we all know what that means. That means it's not going to happen. So you can't just keep making codes more and more onerous without a process to get to achieving them, or else you'll just move into fine territory or move into, like I say, just elevated levels of guilt for everybody involved. So I think the process was noble, and I think the outcome is still unknown. It's still city council struggling with it, because it is in direct opposition to affordability, right? So we're all struggling with affordability. Chloe Udally that's her whole kind of platform, is making things affordable. So if you pit that against, and these buildings, these brickers, are usually in the most affordable parts of town, except maybe the Alphabet District, but otherwise, those are the affordable buildings. They're not Class A office buildings, they're not Class A apartment buildings, they're B and Cs, and that's where kind of we all grew up through Portland living in. So if you clash that with mandatory upgrades, that will be in direct conflict with affordability. So that's the struggle. And I think this is a citywide issue, if not a statewide issue. As Brian mentioned, I think we should all pass a tax. I know everybody runs for the hills when people say that, but I think we all need to do this together, or else there's not going to be a solution for these massive upgrade costs. But
Has a policy or similar policies been implemented elsewhere in the country? That's for you, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, we actually looked pretty heavily at both California and Washington. So California's got a much more robust recommendation. That was really what the technical advisory committee kind of wanted, which was what we call a Bolts Plus. It's pretty close to an ASC 41 without getting too technical. Upgraded, yeah. So and that was passed actually quite some time ago, and pretty much they've had pretty much full compliance down there. So Seattle was looking to do something similar, and they ran into political obstacles, honestly, and so they still have not passed that. Portland's existing code is actually more strict than what Seattle has, because we have an interim code that allows for the active trigger, which I don't believe Seattle has that. So
Within California, was it the same in LA, San Francisco, Sacramento, or I mean, was it statewide, or did they allow individual jurisdictions to kind of dictate what the policy would be?
You know, that's a good question. My understanding is that it's statewide. I know it was implemented in all of the major jurisdictions, so I don't know exactly how they did all of that. I'm sure they told us, but it was 4 years ago.
Well, and I think one of the concerns is just at some point, did the project costs or those upgrades become such an impediment that you say, well, I'm just going to knock the building down?
Yeah, no, that's a valid concern. That's what was one of my number one concerns after having spent 8 years on Landmarks Commission working for historic preservation. The last thing we want to see is all these buildings get demolished because it doesn't make sense to save them, right? And we all know that, it's got to work with the pro forma or it doesn't pencil. It's not going to happen, just like Ben said. And I think what California has going for it and is edging up, since what you talked about, Ben, like 20 years ago, it was really hard to get a seismic upgrade to pencil. All of my clients were really trying to work around them as much as we could. But what we've seen is like areas like the Pearl District and now Central Business District, and as we start getting to the east side, it is starting to work in the pro forma, and people are getting more educated and actually asking for it too, including tenants. And so it is starting to work in the rental rates. It probably doesn't work out on 82nd and Foster if you've got a URM or something like that, But California's always had higher rental rates, and construction costs I'm sure are higher, but not as proportionally as higher. So it's just a different financial equation, and that's a really important thing when City Council thinks about this: is how do you afford it, basically? Because if you can't get to that sweet spot, it's really not going to happen.
Another interesting thing that came up in City Council is that equity disparity. So as the rents can sustain upgrades here in the core, it can't do it on 122nd. So that means less income people are in less safe buildings, which isn't an equation I think the City Council wants to support. So we can't just, again, collectively wait for rents to rise to pay for these things. I think it is a regional question that needs to be answered regionally. So.
Well, and you had mentioned the other day about schools, so that we're requiring kids to go into schools that we know aren't safe. And so as the first test of it, to have schools look at some options of what they can do to upgrade. I know Ben's got some, again, kind of outside the box thoughts on that. So up on the screen up there, I think, is kind of some of the diagram of what it is that's being proposed. So I think kind of at the lowest level, Brian, kind of if you could enlighten all of us to is, what is it that you're talking about as kind of the basic upgrade, and then we'll move into kind of the full meal deal of what are all the bits and pieces and all this kind of fun stuff that we do. And that's where I get to be contractory about it. But like, what is it that you're really trying to accomplish? What's kind of the bare bones upgrade that you're seeing as being viable and cost effective at that kind of sweet spot?
So basically, I'm going to talk about the type 3 buildings because that's the majority of them. That's where all the contention is. In the schools, they're recommending a much more full upgrade, and same with immediate occupancy. But in the type 3s, right now what's required in the code, which, again, and I'm not on the BDS side, so I don't know how much actually is being done or not done, but is basically when you replace your roof, so every 20 years or so, you need a commercial roof replacement. You've got to do that top left parapet bracing, so the parapet can't just fall into the street, and anchor the roof members to the wall. Okay, so that's actually already in the existing code right now. Most people also add a diaphragm, which would just be plywood sheathing because it makes for a lot better underlayment for your roofing. That piece is being added or proposed to be added. And then, of course, enforcing to make sure people are doing it when they're coming in to pull the roofing permits. And I think this is actually one of the problems is, the city is a very complex, bureaucratic organization, so a lot of roofers come in and pull the permit. Well, it's a trade permit, it's not necessarily a building permit, so that's how some of these things have gotten, not enforced, essentially. There's not actually a life safety examiner reviewing some of these things. So the only additional requirement that was recommended to City Council right now, and this is, to be honest, is not enough to really get a full resiliency to the building, but it matches what we felt was appropriate with the funding source from the Senate Bill 311, is the additional tie-in if you have a 2-story or more building of the floor to the wall. And that's what you see on the right-hand sketch there, where the floor is now anchored to the wall, because most of these unreinforced buildings, they didn't know there was any lateral loads. They're just gravity loads, right? So they're just stacked bricks, and the framing members just sit in on a ledger pocket. They're not attached at all to the wall. So if anything shakes, they just pancake right out. So it's kind of a basic thing to just, and it's not that difficult to anchor the floor to the wall and to anchor the roof to the wall. So on the far right, you see what still could happen, though, is if the wall is too tall and thin, the wall could still break, basically. So, we didn't address that because what ends up happening in an occupied building is you've got to put a vertical beam every so often there, and really you should do a diaphragm on the floor, which would be more plywood. And, you're talking about a finished apartment building, tearing all the finishes off the outside wall, tearing the flooring out, and, it's really not practical unless you got a lot of money. So, the minimum would be just basically tying the floor to the wall, and so the building just can't fall out and collapse in the street. So that's kind of where we ended up at. It's a pretty modest ask compared to what other jurisdictions have done. This is an example of Christchurch where you see the red dots. That would be where the floor is tied to the wall. The wall just fell right out in the street, and this is why they had a lot of casualties in the street, is a lot of the buildings did this, basically. So
around that, so again, it's, you can do a little bit, you can do a lot, or a lot of times it's kind of a different combination there within. And I think, just talking about the different levels of seismic upgrade, you mentioned a little bit about elective, but the immediate occupancy versus the current code. So immediate occupancy is one we talked about. So you go and you're talking about a change of use or a major upgrade that's is that monetarily driven?
Immediate occupancy is actually higher than that. So that's higher than even what building code is. That was basically like an emergency service provider and making sure that basically no damage happens and it's functionally available immediately after the event. Very few buildings fall into that category. A URM would probably be about your last choice to put in that category. Unfortunately, we do have a few, and I'm not sure why. But anyways, more commonly it would be like full seismic current code, and that would be usually what we run into. And it's usually not an enlightened business owner that just wants to do it out of the goodness of their heart. It's usually like an adaptive reuse project where we're going to drive higher rents, and it makes sense to do that because we've got to do that to be able to increase the use of the building. Bolts Plus, which is on there, that's one step down, and that would basically be what like California required. It's more of a collapse prevention strategy. The building might still be heavily damaged after the event. And then elective, which is kind of like where our recommendations came in, like much lower, is really just kind of, right now, actually, if you want to go down and propose any kind of seismic upgrade to your building, if you have one that's a URM, the city will pass it. I mean, they're trying to encourage people to do it. They won't charge you for the structural review of that piece, and they want things done. But the challenge I kind of have with that with owners from an investment standpoint is just, you're not going to get any credit for that either, though. Like if the mandatory upgrades come down the pike, you kind of want to make sure you're spending your money in a way that you're going to get, future return on that investment. So.
Well, and just to kind of the nuts and bolts of it is, I brought these, it's kind of a fun show and tell, but it's like, well, what's the big deal about, it's some nails and some bolts to put in there. But what really gets the challenge is very rarely is the structure just sitting open, ready for this. And so what we always kind of joke about is the hardest part to estimate or to come up with to estimate the cost of this upgrade is it's all of the things that aren't shown in the drawings. It's really easy to show, put a bolt every 2 feet, put a strap and connect it to it, and then have a strap out. Okay, well, great. Some buildings have plumbing. Some buildings have electricity running through them. And so what becomes the challenge is you don't often know what a lot of those are until you get in and open them up. So, for example, here's a detail from a seismic retrofit that we did for the Martha Washington building down on 11th and Main there. And we had the benefit of this one that was fully unoccupied, where we could get in, you rip off the roof, you can get in there, and then even then you're having to find orientation of joist, get in there, add blocking. In order to get blocking, you have to now cut back the floor 2 feet. So that means we now have to shore it. We have to shore it all the way down. So now we have to go down, we have to excavate out of a basement. Unfortunately, excavators are really big. It's hard to get them into basements. So now we're saw cutting, we're having to excavate by hand to pour this footing, to get shotcrete or cast in place concrete walls or brace frames. And so, engineers love to just put big concrete shear walls right on the corner of your building and it takes care of everything. Again, typically retailers have a different opinion about putting giant concrete shear walls right at their storefront. And so that's where every single project is unique in that the condition of the floor, the condition of the roof, what has to actually be done to the building. That's my advice to anyone here, is everyone has the takeaway of there's no way to just say seismic upgrades cost $25 a foot or $11 a foot, depending on who's putting out the numbers. That every single case is unique. And again, a good engineer should come up with the solution that is least impactful to the facade, to the occupancy, and ultimately to the flexibility of the building. And that's where, anyone that's looking at buying a building or has a client that is looking at one, I would say the first thing you need to do is go find a design team and a contractor, because you have to walk that building. Again, for a new 6-story apartment building, anyone can look at that and say, well, we know those costs, right? Once you get out of the dirt, it's pretty much the same thing every time through. But with seismic, with historic renovation, that is not necessarily the case. So I was looking at one of the things that around those costs is occupied versus unoccupied. And this is, I think, the challenge that's really being faced by a lot of this mandatory protocol coming down is, well, I can't kick everyone out of my building, so how can I do this? And on a previous panel, there's a client of yours, Walter. Can you explain a little bit about how he managed to do voluntary full seismic upgrades, or not quite full, but significant upgrades of his buildings while maintaining majority occupancy?
Yeah, Walt McMoney's, he owns several large URM buildings, and he was kind of enlightened and knew that he wanted to make these safety upgrades regardless of code. So he came up with a plan basically with an engineer and started working incrementally every time he'd have turnover. It's like, okay, I'm going to go in and do the blocking and tie the floor in that unit, and these were long-term holds, so he was able to come up with a long-term strategy essentially to basically be able to get it done incrementally with the least amount of disruption, and also to cash flow essentially to his building. And I think one of the things Walt talks about, and I'm not a real estate expert, but of just how hard it was to get insurance for these buildings and things before he had done the upgrade. So it was also part of his business strategy. He did want to have the buildings be safe and be better investments, but at the same time it also helped his business strategy long term. So that was kind of how Walt did it. I think if you're doing a real full seismic upgrade like what you just described, Jake, I mean, it is really hard to do that in an occupied building. And I think that everybody on the URM committee, other than maybe the engineers, realize that. And for the record, architects don't like shear walls in retail corners either. Of course, that's where they always propose it first, right? So, but I think what we tried to do, and I don't know, to get to how could that cost $11 a square foot? Well, every building is different, so that was a really big challenge for the committee. Was how do you analyze costs? That's the first thing everybody asks, right? And by getting it down to more of a prescriptive of like, you've got to attach every other floor joist to the wall, period, basically, and that was kind of it, then I think you can go in and look at that incrementally. What does that cost? And, like in a 3-story building, we talked to a seismic retrofit contractor who basically said, well, you'd go into this one unit on the second floor and you would do it at the ceiling and the floor, so you just vacate one unit at a time and you don't vacate the third floor or the first floor. And incrementally, you can go around the building and pretty effectively take care of that. The roof's fairly easy. When you place the roof, you can get all that stuff from the top. So that was kind of the idea, because you're right. If you're trying to do foundation upgrades and all that kind of stuff, that just gets to be a lot bigger deal.
Up on the screen there, it's lines with different colors on there, but this is some of the findings in terms of, so the city of Portland came up with some cost projections for a series of specific buildings around. And so without getting into the nitty gritty, if you could kind of explain the bar graph at the bottom of what the different colors represent.
Yeah, so the city, unfortunately, they didn't come out with this information until they went to the city council, or maybe it would have alleviated some of the friction of the discussions, but they tried to show what the House Bill 311 valuation of the 15-year property tax exemption with, understanding your taxes go up 3% a year, what that valuation would be worth versus what the cost of the existing upgrades and then the current recommended additional upgrades would be and how those would wash out. So they studied 20 properties, and what you see is, like, if you look at the far right one, the blue bar on the left is the additional required upgrades, or recommended required upgrades. The bar on the right, that white and green bar, it's kind of hard to see, is the valuation of the property tax exemption. So anywhere where the bar on the right is greater than the blue bar on the left, it shows that over 15 years, essentially, it would cover the cost of what's being asked in the recommended upgrades. And the green bar on top, I think, is just the cost to replace the roof itself, and the red bar is the cost of doing the upgrades on the roof when you're doing that work. So in some cases, you can see it pays for actually everything in there. And, I think then maybe they would think, well, maybe we need to do more. I don't know. But it doesn't in all cases. And I think one of the challenges, too, is, how do you monetize a tax exemption of 15 years and be able to put that into, like, a property owner's pocket to be able to do the upgrades now? Some of those things are trying to be worked out with Prosper Portland, formerly PDC, of like how can they create bridge loans and things like that based on the tax base exemption. So.
And to be clear, you did not generate these cost estimates.
No, I did not.
Okay.
I did an independent study with R&H Construction and one of our structural engineers of just the typical floor to wall detail, because we had a lot of the property owners got very vocal toward the end of the process. Unfortunately, they just weren't engaged earlier, and I don't know if that was a communication issue on the city side or just, as it started becoming more real, people, started paying attention. But they were kind of going back to when they'd come with, well, this is going to cost, one of the ones came and said, it's going to cost us $680,000. We're going to have to vacate the building for a year and all this stuff. And I said, okay, well, do you mind coming in? We'll meet. I'll go over it with you, and let me take a look at what the engineer is proposing, because the engineer did the estimates, and then they did other ones. And, it turned out they were basically doing a full seismic upgrade, and it's like, that's actually not what's being recommended right now. And, so we worked with R&H Construction to figure out how many floor ties you would have, how much it would cost, and the strategy of how you would actually do it. And instead of $680,000, it was $110,000. And in their case, the property tax exemption was over $200,000. So, I don't think that people were actually tracking, what was actually being proposed on the table at the end and like what the benefits of the House Bill SB 311 could bring. So, and all that's still a discussion, obviously. So.
All right, thanks. Do you have any more kind of comment on the traditional seismic before we shift gears a little bit and give Ben the platform here? So, we talked about that a little bit earlier of, that New York Times article that I know put the fear of God in me, that everything was going to go and I had to get my paperwork in order. But since then, that hasn't happened yet, although every time we have one of these meetings, I'm sure that's when it's going to happen, in the true sense of irony. But Ben, again, has put a lot of effort and a lot of money and time into exploring what are different solutions. So instead of just going and using this type of a technology to say, well, let's just go back and retrofit and put bolts and straps on it, are there other things that we could do that might be smarter, that might be better as a community? And so I kind of wanted to give Ben an opportunity to talk about the risks and, again, there are other natural disasters, and so I'll kind of leave it open-ended for you on that, Ben, but what do you see as some of the, I guess, maybe some of the short-sightedness or some of the challenges that you see with this approach that we've kind of been going down?
Yeah, thanks, Jake. So a little bit different. This is just kind of a completely different way to think about this problem. And there's a great book called Black Swan by a guy named Nassim Taleb. And he talks about how society changes. We're all preparing for the big earthquake, but it'll actually be a meteor that hits us and changes Portland. And that happens time and time again throughout the millennials. We're all preparing for this, but it's really that's going to change us. So with that in mind, with that being a kind of a constant, I brought into question, why are we preparing for the big earthquake? And so this chart shows deaths since the founding of America, essentially, and it equates to about 6 people per year since the beginning of the United States, and 13 people per year die from vending machines falling over on them. 11 people die from lightning strikes per year. So I think that might say 14 from dog bites. So if we really dig into the numbers and see that it's not, and make it not a fear-based decision-making process, just make it more a logical-based decision-making process, I think we'll make much better decisions as a society, as we always do. So if we look at the numbers prove out that we should likely not spend $1 billion in Portland on seismic upgrades. That's my own personal opinion. But I think with $1 billion, we can make better public schools that help our kids for the next 100 years. I think we can help the opioid crisis that's devastating our inner cities every second. More people die per hour in the state of Oregon from opioids than they have in the United States from earthquakes since the beginning of time. So just logically start there. And push the fear aside, and then look at the reality of the topic at hand. Because every life lost is certainly important and sad, but we can't pivot an entire society to address one life lost. I don't think so.
Well, and to that end, you had the core first.
So this is stemmed from that, and I liken it to the Midwest. I grew up in the Midwest, and we had tornadoes, and I was terrified of tornadoes as a little kid. But no one would suggest making the entire Midwest tornado-proof. That would be absurd, right? But we're kind of entertaining that in the regard of earthquakes, because to make the Midwest tornado-proof would just break the bank of the Midwest. So instead, they moved to safe areas. That's what I did as a kid, and that's what you do in every other natural disaster, which I think is really fascinating. No other natural disaster do you ask the building to do everything, right? Not in fires, not in hurricanes, not tidal waves, not any other natural disaster. So why are we asking the building to do everything in an earthquake, to protect the person? And I think if you apply the same thinking to tornadoes, like I mentioned, if we just put safe areas in buildings, you could do it for 20, 15% of the cost, and start to address the fear, the potential of this large Cascadian subduction zone, but do it at a cost that's so much more attainable for all of us, and then pivot that other $750 million of Portland's assets towards things that are really critical, really important. And especially if you couple it with early seismic detection systems. So these have been around the world for 25 years now, successful in Japan, successful in Mexico, Guatemala has one, Turkey has one. And California has been struggling to come up with $250 million to finance this next stage of their seismic regional system, and $250 million, that's nothing compared to, like I say, $1 billion just here in Portland. So again, if we think logically and apply what the rest of the world's been doing for 25 years, we'll leap way ahead. We could have a regional system in Portland that tells all of us via text that there's an earthquake coming, and if it does come from the subduction zone, it would be about 73 seconds to get to your phone. And with 73 seconds, I would suggest that you can get out of every single one of these Class 3 buildings in Portland. 1, 2, 3 stories, 4,000 square feet, 5,000 square feet. We've done tests. You can get the whole, Boise Elliott is a small URM school in Northeast Portland. The entire school emptied out with kids joking with each other, jabbing at each other in about a minute and 10 seconds. 350 kids out of a 2-story building, long halls, like I said, joking around the entire time. So if you put 73 seconds on any of us, I would say we'd all be out in the street within 73 seconds of this building, down that hall, around the corner, down the stairs, and out the door. So why aren't we applying that thinking? I'm a little befuddled by it, and there's deniers here in the state of Oregon, including some of our seismologists, who say these early detection systems don't work. They were just proven in Napa at that earthquake about 4 years ago. And this is a building, we put it in over in northeast Portland. We put in a system. It was about $65,000 for the system. This has already successfully detected 3 earthquakes. It's really fascinating. It detects the P wave that is out front of the S wave. And it's given, this building is designed to alert all the tenants with a text if an earthquake triggers the benchmarks that we've set in the algorithm. So we set it at about a 7.5, and of course we've gotten nowhere close to that. But it's detected a Tillamook Forest earthquake and gave about 14 seconds, and you guys know that's pretty close. So again, it gives you a warning, and that warning can be used to that warning in this building shuts down the gas valves and lowers the elevator to the ground floor since it's just a relay. So just think of that, what we can do, and that was $65,000. That could go in any single building. You could all get the text. We have 75 people on that text chain. I could add all of you guys to that text chain that system is garnering. That's a Canadian system out of Vancouver, but there's 3-4 major manufacturers around the world. Japan, it's successful every single time. They have about 10,000 quakes a year. It slows down their high-speed trains. It notifies the center of Tokyo. So again, why don't we integrate something much less expensive and then solve the problem in a completely different approach? That's our thinking.
And what was the system? How does it work? There's the dumbed down version, if you will. So is there something up there that knows that it's shaking on top of the building?
Actually, I just call everybody. I feel it and call everybody really quick. Exactly. I start with my wife and then move on from there. So it's really fascinating. If you guys hit the table or something or hit anything, 2 waves emanate from the epicenter of that hit. It's a P wave and an S wave. And the P wave goes faster than the S wave because it's a shorter sine curve, so it moves through the crustal surface quicker. And these, the equipment in the radiator building or throughout Japan, are essentially lab-grade accelerometers. They're not listening to the Earth, they're just feeling the Earth. And they feel that disruption. And at the radiator, there's 3 that are buried about 12 feet deep in concrete. And if those 3 all feel the same thing at the same time, that's of a magnitude that is an indicator that there's a larger one behind it. That's the fascinating thing. Now, at the radiator, it's not large enough to triangulate, meaning it can't give us the time to that S wave coming. But in the California study and all throughout Japan, they're far enough apart. They're called geophones. They're far enough apart that they can triangulate and then give you the exact time to count down. So in Napa, it said in that one building that it was successful at 12, 11, 10, 9, and then the earthquake hit. So just think if we implement that in Portland, if we city council just dedicated $100 million, just that much, for instance, we'd have a regional system that would help all of us do what we wanted with that information. But I think it's, aside of Brian's great work, I think it's absurd to ask a 3,000 square foot building on Belmont 32nd to do a $250,000 upgrade when you could vacate the building. And I would advocate vacating the building regardless of it being upgraded or not. Because as Brian said, they're not meant to stay up. They could still collapse. They're just meant to kind of get over that hump. So a little different approach.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think we had a link that wasn't going to work, the dog there, but I watched the video. If you're ever kind of bored, there's a great YouTube video of just a static camera. So here I said I wasn't going to. Yeah. Okay, we're going to act it out here. But no, it's in an office in California, and they've got just a golden retriever laying on the floor. All of a sudden, it gets up and hightails it out of the picture. The guy gets up, looks around, and then it starts shaking. So, animals.
Yeah. So
it did come
beginning of the video, but. Pets can detect these P waves. It's fascinating. So this dog, it's really cool. This dog gets up, runs out, and then we're careful. And then the shaking starts probably 10 seconds later, and then everybody runs out behind the dog. So it's fascinating. It's out there. It's a fact. It works. And I think that's what I would advocate for. And then that could be a regional problem rather than a singular building owner on 22nd and Lovejoy that has to solve it.
I think I might have followed the dog.
What's also really fascinating about that, we spent hours looking at all this from around the world. Everybody chooses to move. I know the this is getting into the weeds a bit, but drop, cover, and hold is absolutely absurd to me. We met with Red Cross in Washington, D.C., and they admitted that the drop, cover, and hold was an edict sent out by the Red Cross in the 60s because the federal government said, hey, Red Cross, what should we do in the event of an earthquake? And they're like, drop, cover, and hold. And they admitted to us, it was really interesting, their scientific advisory committee admitted to us that there has never been one study done as to the efficacy of drop, cover, and hold. Meanwhile, we teach it to everybody, all of us, kids in 3- and 4-story URM buildings. We teach them to get under a desk that would hold 54 pounds. So I think it's just crazy, and what we all subscribe to, but I think that was done because that's like, I always ascribe this to also. Every evening my wife says, did you lock all the doors? So I walk around and lock all the doors in the house. What in the hell is that going to do if someone wants to come in our house? Nothing. But it does address your fear. So you just lock the door and then you can go to bed, even though the robber would just go right through the glass right next to the door and come into the house. So I think what we're trying to do is just assuage our fear somehow, and I think that's why a safe zone kind of addresses that. It's locking the door in the bedroom, around the house, and then you can move on to other things like opioid epidemics or anything other the things that are much more critical in our lives. But that's getting into the weeds. So drop, cover, and hold, I think we should really be advocating for our kids to get out of these buildings and making the facades at the exitways safe. And you can do that for way, way cheaper. But again, we would all want to be out of the Mac Club, I guarantee it. No one's going to be sitting in here waiting for anything to fall down. I'd advocate leaving the building. A little bit different than the Red Cross, and they even admitted to us in some closed-door meetings that they think it's also kind of crazy. The head of the Red Cross in Portland said it's crazy, drop, cover, and hold. So we're all kind of getting behind something that most of us think is crazy, which is crazy. So I think that's just kind of getting into the weeds.
What about stop, drop, and roll? Is that also obsolete?
Yeah, with fire, just run.
All right, so again, I really appreciate the perspective, and it sounds like, again, it's not any one of them is going to do it, but the combination of smart decisions based on facts, not fear. But again, kudos to Brian for persevering through that long process. I guess, do you have any updates kind of in terms of the next steps, and then we'll open it up for questions? Do you have an idea of timeline?
Sure, and one thing I would be clear about too is obviously our committee was tasked with just URMs, you know, and I agree with Ben's perspective. We need to be looking at bigger solutions too, like the early detection, and there's no reason why FEMA shouldn't even be investing in that kind of stuff. It's a federal thing, not just a state by state or city by city. So those are things to contemplate, and I think, you know, obviously you got to be able to get, if you run out of the building, you don't want the building falling on you. So there's, you know, and the core first could work inside, but there's still obviously people in the public right away and stuff. So we got to think, you know, holistically about how that would happen. So right now, and the recommendations to City Council were basically what I described, and they decided to take another year based off a lot of negative feedback from property owners to study this in more detail yet again. So, and then have the staff come back and make recommendations 1 year from now as to what they would require. So who knows, you know, what's going to happen. I think, you know, to be fair to the URM committee was basically just making recommendations, and it kind of gets outside of that committee's purview to make decisions about how to allocate our resources best. That really goes to the city leadership, and, you know, we only have finite resources, so maybe it isn't best to put all that money into the URMs or only some of it in there. So I think we need to think kind of more globally about how do you solve the problem and what's the best use of the limited resources we have, you know, but that's basically where it's at.
Great. All right, thank you, gentlemen. So I'm assuming we're getting tight on time. We are. So yeah, does anyone have any questions for our experts here?
How does retrofitting a wood frame building that's, let's say, 50 years or older compare cost-wise?
So with masonry or just a wood building?
Wood frame, yeah. Like a 50-unit apartment property, it's made from wood frame, it's 50 years old.
Well, it kind of depends on the retrofitting strategy, but again, a lot of the times it's going to be just additional connections. So it's going to be getting in, exposing the structure. Hopefully, it's connected to the foundations. But again, in the old days, people just worried about things falling up, and so it is just kind of getting in and doing a lot of things. So that the costs aren't necessarily specific to it being masonry. It has to do with making sure that structural members are connected to each other. So whether it's a steel building or if you see overpasses and bridges out there that are connecting bits of concrete together, it's just the cost more often than not is just getting access to the structural members so that you can do the super fancy putting 25 nails into a strap and then bolting it down.
I mean, one of the things that I would say is like wood is a much lighter building and it's more flexible, right? So it tends to perform a lot better in a seismic event. And I think that in seismic terms, like the mass of the building attracts the load, right? So a heavy building has much more giant foundations and things required. So that kind of stuff you kind of get a lot easier in a wood building.
Hi, just a couple of questions. One, how is the city dealing with the conflict between historic preservation and safety? So if you've got a building on the National Register, how is it addressing that? And second, are you seeing that appraisers are taking into account any concept of increased valuation because of seismic upgrades?
Well, you're more on the real estate side than I have been, so I think that's coming, whether it's here or now. I couldn't give you a great answer on that. I think that's probably a takeaway for everybody though, is that generally, like you can look to California, Washington's brought this back up again. We're studying it. Generally, the trend is it is going to be moving toward more resiliency, more requirements. So, and I think the market's going to recognize that and the value of whether that's been done or not. And we're already seeing that in the insurance market and stuff as well. So, as far as the risk goes, so that's. And then on the historical, that's a good question too. So the city didn't talk too much about that. That was really something I was more interested in because we don't want to see buildings being torn down, obviously, and stuff. And if we create an equation that doesn't work, that could happen. And it probably still would happen for some buildings. But historic buildings typically also have access to a lot of other funding mechanisms, like you get a 20% federal tax rebate, on the cost valuation of doing projects. You can get a 10-year tax freeze on your property tax value, the pre-development costs. So there's other tools that come into play for a historic building that start to make the seismic upgrade a more feasible component than just an old building, basically, that's not on the register.
Any other questions?
And just to follow up on that, what we're seeing and hearing murmurings is not a raising of the value if you do the seismic upgrade, but a decrease of the value if you don't. So when buyers are becoming savvy that Portland's entertaining this potential mandatory upgrade, so when buildings come on the market, they're actually devaluing them, knowing that this may be added to the equation later. So I think it's still a rent-based ROI, but then when you put the potential to add another $300,000 into the cost, then it will just drop that value. So.
Seismic retrofitting's been going on for a number of years now. Are the products proven themselves? Has there been a case where they've done it in Northern California or down in the Bay Area or somewhere like that, gone through an earthquake and proven that this engineering and the cost and expense that's put into it, is it proven to be effective?
I think that's a great question. I think by and large, yes, it has been proven. I mean, just in the example of the Christchurch, where one building that had the upgrade didn't collapse, the other one crushed the bus. But I don't know, like, all bets are off when when in a certain type of event, I think, to some degree. But so you're basically kind of trying to get more margins of safety in there, in a massive subduction zone earthquake. I don't know that anyone's going to be able to tell you with any kind of scientific veracity what exactly is going to happen, but we do know from physics and other events and stuff what things work. So.
And also, Simpson Strong Tie makes a lot of these products you guys are probably familiar with. And one thing they've had the most success with is in the soft stories down in California. And there's a number of soft story buildings around Portland. That's the tuck under apartment buildings where there's the garages underneath the entire apartment building. that's the worst kind, right? And I would even advocate for, because it's such a simple fix, to kind of tie that in to give it a little bit of a moment, so that whole mass, as Brian said, isn't sitting above essentially nothing, legs going one way. So Simpson Strong Tie has some products that have been very successful in California because they have smaller quakes, more of them, and even small quakes bring down those soft story buildings. So those apartment buildings, if anybody has those, that would be an easy exterior fix that would take you way deeper into the seismic equation. So.
I'll try to frame this. So, specifically speaking on the multifamily buildings here along like 21st, 23rd area, and it sounds like the work could only be completed when the units are vacated. So you talk about Walt McMoney's doing a turn, but if you're looking at vacating multiple units at the same time, such as the second floor, is the city talking about, with tenant landlord laws in place right now, the 90-day eviction notice, as well as paying for move-out costs, is there any sort of talk about leniency with those tenant landlord laws with making these or doing this retrofitting?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, two of the contingencies of the recommendations that the panel made to City Council were that, one, that the rent eviction be waived in these so that the work could be done and not at a penalty to the landlord, and two, that the House bill or the Senate Bill 311 actually takes effect and is monetizable before they would be basically asked to be able to do this.
Okay, I think we're going to have to shut it down. Okay. Thank you very much, gentlemen. That was very informative. And we would like to offer each one of you a bottle of Stoller wine. Wow. If you don't drink the wine, then we'll auction one of those off. I'll take it home. Looks like all of you.
Exactly. Thank you.
Now, do you have business cards? Would you take questions from people here who, after we adjourn? Sure. Okay, great. I think with that, we are going to adjourn this meeting. There is no meeting in July, and we look forward to seeing you here in August. Thank you.